Hello and welcome to Thinking Competition, the podcast by CS Associados, focusing on competition, business trends and economic regulation. This is a free zone for critical thinking on the markets of today and tomorrow. We want to challenge commonplace ideas and try to connect the dots in a rapidly changing world. We want to keep on asking why. Join us on this journey.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Thinking Competitions, the podcast on antitrust and economic regulation by CS Associados. We are very happy to have with us today a household name for competition economists and lawyers, Dr. Jorge Padilla. He is a renowned expert in antitrust economics and currently the chair at Compass Lexecon. He holds master's and PhD degrees in economics from Oxford University and has published very extensively on competition policy and industrial organization matters. He has also given expert testimony in numerous cases before competition authorities, the Commission, as well as national and European courts. Dr. Padilla, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
My pleasure is mine, Gonçalo.
The topic we had selected for discussion with you today has to do with the draft merger guidelines that the Commission has recently published for consultation and that are generating quite a bit of discussion on some points. I'm still digesting, but I thought it might be interesting to raise some topics with you. As a first general point that I would like to raise, these draft guidelines seem to take up the Draghi reports of the end of 2024 in recognizing some of the main challenges that European companies and Europe face, in particular the need for consolidation as a means of scaling up. So the entire European champions argument seems to be back on the table, with the goal of having larger European companies that can be more competitive on the global stage. But in my mind, at least, I would think, perhaps I'm wrong, that single market fragmentation, so subsisting barriers to cross-border trade and investment, would be a greater obstacle to the growth of European firms with a real cross-border footprint than merger control policy per se. And I recall an IMF study from December 2024, so a year and a half ago, estimating that intra-EU barriers to trade would be equivalent on average to an internal tariff of 44% for trade on goods and 110% for trade on services, which is really quite staggering. It seems like we've given up on the single market altogether. And on the other hand, coming back to merger control policy, it is a fact that DG Comp has been prohibiting less than one merger per year, more or less. I mean, I counted 8 or 9 prohibition decisions for the past decade, which suggests that merger control policy was never really the main obstacle. So the question here, I think, is, are these draft merger guidelines addressing the right issue but in the wrong place?
Right, very good question. So let's first focus on what is the problem of the European economy. And the question is, the problem is fundamentally one of lack of productivity. We don't have, our productivity growth has been, disappointing for at least 1 decade, in some countries for 2 decades. And without an increase in productivity, you don't have growth. And if you don't have growth, then you cannot pay high wages. It's not just a question of profits, it's also a question of wages. If there are no profits, there is no investment. In many countries, especially in Southern Europe, you see that real wages have remained flat or even decreased. And when you don't have growth and you cannot pay, you cannot invest, then there is dissatisfaction and frustration. And that leads to political polarization, people looking for enemies or, problems here and there. Sometimes it's the immigrants, sometimes it's the opponents, political opponents, and so on. So, but ultimately, the problem is productivity. Now, the question is, where is our productivity lacking? Well, interestingly, in many sectors of the economy, our companies remain fairly productive. It is in one particular part of the economy where we are not delivering, and that's the digital economy. High-tech companies, software, cloud computing, now artificial intelligence, it is there that our productivity suffers. And because we have not been able to develop the companies, the large big tech companies that the US has been able to develop, or that the Chinese have been able to develop, we seem to be lagging behind in terms of productivity. Now, as you said, the causes of this productivity lag are multiple, and putting the emphasis on merger control is disproportionate. There are a number of obvious reasons which perhaps are likely to weigh more than merger control. Lack of a single market, definitely. With respect to these type of industries in particular, you have a very significant fixed cost, very significant upfront costs, most of which are sunk. And if you don't have a very large market, then you necessarily struggle. Okay. And I think that there we have a significant disadvantage, both with China and with the United States, because they have much larger markets with a single language and a single culture, etc. So our companies there are gonna struggle. Do we need a scale in these industries? Yes. Should we get it through integrating markets within the union to a greater extent? Yes. In particular, I think that it's not just a question of ensuring that there is a single market for goods, which is, I think, that the one that the IMF was looking into. But more importantly, you also need a single market for services, and in particular, you need a single market for talent. You look at the engineers behind many of the big tech companies in the US, many of them were born elsewhere. In fact, many of them were born in Europe. And so that's one problem. There is another problem, which I think that is more significant than potentially merger control, and that is related also to the single market, but is the single capital markets union. We develop startups in Europe. The problem is that they find difficult to scale up, and they find difficult, because there is no single market for services, but very importantly, and most importantly even, is because they are not able to obtain the funding that is necessary to scale up their operations. They have to rely on the savings on their own country. And, typically the European saver, like any other investor, is concerned with concentrating risks. Investing in, putting money in venture capital in the US gives you access to a wide set of investments. Some of these will succeed, some of them will fail, but on average, you're going to do well. If you are putting your money in Portugal, in Spain, in Germany, in France, and all that you can access with a venture capital fund in your country is investment projects in your own country, that is much less diversified. And it compounds with the problem before, because the Portuguese companies or Portuguese projects or startups are going to be fully Portuguese, the Spanish are going to be fully Spanish, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the US, you're going to have access to projects where the leader may be South African, the engineers are Indian, the relevant marketing people are American, and there are some clever European guys around, and all those combinations make sure that you have access to better projects. So as a result, what happens is that we in Europe save a lot, but we take our savings to the US to invest. And that's part of the problem. Now, having said so, I may give the impression that merger control is irrelevant. And that's not true either. Merger control is relevant. And the statistic that you referred to, while correct, I think that it captures only part of the reality of merger control. Merger control is not just about clearance and prohibition. It's also about what sort of clearance decisions you make, what kind of remedies you impose. And it's also
how long
about
the cases take.
How long the cases take, and also whether in anticipation of outcomes that are likely to be adverse, there are mergers that are withdrawn or mergers that don't even take place. Now, it is important that we say this because oftentimes you find competition agencies, and in particular the European Commission, saying two things that are mutually inconsistent. One is merger control doesn't matter for productivity in Europe. But if you look at the last competition brief of the European Commission, what you're going to read is that the European Commission rightly says that it may have saved a fortune. I think that many, many billions of euros to European consumers as a result of its merger interventions. Now, the two things cannot be compatible. Either your merger control really contributes to well-being in Europe and is a first order policy, or it isn't. But it cannot be one thing and the other. And finally, I would like to mention that if you think about the number of companies that ultimately explain the rate of growth of an economy, well, depending on the economy, there can be many or very few. If you look at the rate of growth of the US economy of the last decade, it's largely driven by 7 to 9 companies. And
the big tech, yes.
The big tech. So any interventions that you make in those markets are likely to make a very significant or to have a very significant impact. In Europe, ultimately, if you look at what drives the growth of any of our economies, the Spanish economy is an example, again, is a handful of companies. And again, regulation and competition policy may matter for many of them. So I think that, it is not the philosopher's stone, if I may quote Harry Potter. It's not going to solve all the problems. But I don't think that we can neglect merger control as a driver, among others, of innovation and growth in our economies.
Thank you. That's a very interesting note, and I think it connects perhaps to the second point that we had to discuss, which has to do with something which has been there all along, which is efficiencies, merger-specific efficiencies as kind of countervailing factors to anti-competitive effects. The draft guidelines introduce a new concept which seemed to give more breathing space to efficiencies, which is a concept of theories of benefit alongside the more traditional theories of harm. And the Commission actually encourages merging parties to bring their case on their theories of benefit case at a very early stage, rather than just using it as an efficiency defense against potential objections later on. The Commission speaks about direct efficiencies, or cost savings, and dynamic efficiencies, and there's a great emphasis on dynamic competitive potential throughout the guidelines, and kind of dynamic efficiencies such as stronger incentives to invest or innovate as a result of the merger. And perhaps telco is the sector that we all think of that has been complaining about this. On this point of theories of benefits and countervailing efficiencies, this seems to me to be more of a codification of previous practice and something really new, but perhaps there's a new emphasis on this. Do you think that the Commission is, in future and based on these guidelines, going to possibly give more weight to evidence on efficiencies than it has done previously, to compensate against anti-competitive effects, or will things remain more or less the same?
I think it's complex, and I mean, forecasting the future is always a very complicated exercise. But I think that there is an opportunity following the new guidelines that efficiencies play a more significant role. Although I'll caveat that in a second. So let me tell you what I think is good, what I think that could be improved, and what the real challenges are, and maybe they cannot be overcome. So I like the way that the Commission talks now, or the new guidelines, the draft guidelines talk about theory of benefit. To some extent, you could think that it's not entirely new. I mean, I think that the Forum CEO already included a section in which you had to talk about the business rationale. And the business rationale had to be a theory of benefit, because, I mean, if you wrote in the business rationale, the purpose of this merger is to increase prices to meal consumers, you were not getting very far. Now, it is true that typically that section was very short, written almost in passing, and not much emphasis was given to it. Even if, to tell the truth, for me, it was a critical section, and one that I like to discuss with my clients, because I really wanted to understand why is it that they were merging? What is the theory of benefit? So I think that the new guidelines, by placing, first changing the name of what used to be business rationale into the theory of benefit, and putting it more on a level playing field with the theory of harm, I think that will encourage the parties to elaborate and to take that more seriously. And I think that that is positive. It is positive not only conceptually, it may be relevant in practice, in the sense that if there is a well-articulated theory of benefit, I would expect that the Commission, when assessing potential anti-competitive effects, is going to look at the merger with that color in mind. It's going to look at those potential anti-competitive effects, but keeping in mind that there is a story that justifies the merger that has nothing to do with exploiting consumers or exploiting customers. And because the assessment of anti-competitive effects is not entirely scientific, but quasi-scientific, the same way that the agency will rely on opinions from third parties through the market test, I think that the theory of benefit, especially if consistent with internal documents, will color the way that the Commission assesses anti-competitive effects. Now, the theory of benefit is not only relevant for the completion of this business rationale part of the Form CO, it can be the basis of an efficiency defense. There, I'm much less optimistic. Because whereas I recognize and value the effort that has been made in the production of the draft guidelines to create and explain in a detailed way the taxonomy of all potential benefits and efficiencies, it remains the case that the Commission is going to face significant hurdles when assessing a potential efficiency defense. One hurdle is evidentiary. The Commission doesn't have the ability to test those efficiencies in the way that it can test, for example, a market definition, or it can test market shares, or it can test potential, competitive effects, or diversion ratios, closeness of competition, etc. Why? Because it cannot go to the competitors and the customers and tell them this is what these guys plan to do with the efficiencies, with the merger post-transaction. What do you think? For confidentiality reasons, for asymmetry of information reasons. So the market test is not going to be available. So they will have to rely on internal documents, and they will have to rely on economic evidence. And that creates a problem, because, as we know, the Commission relies very heavily on the market test in order to assess the credibility of assertions made by the parties. Secondly, the Commission has not changed the criteria that are going to be used in order to assess those efficiencies. So we still have verifiability, measure specificity, and pass on to consumers. All those are problematic. In particular, in my opinion, the three of them are problematic. One is because the easier one, to some extent, is pass on, even if some people think that is more complicated. In my view, it's not that complicated, because we know that any efficiency is going to be clawed back in part, but we also know that it's not going to be clawed back in full. So I think that may affect the magnitude of the efficiencies that are credited, but they are not going to lead to, that condition doesn't typically lead to ignore the efficiencies altogether. An example would be, for example, the MassMobile Orange transaction, where the Commission recognizes some efficiencies, discounts them, but it recognizes some. Measure specificity is a much more problematic condition, has always been problematic, because it requires specifying a counterfactual. Now, you know that the counterfactual sometimes when assessing efficiencies is not exactly the same counterfactual as when you're assessing anti-competitive effects. It can go very far, and that has been problematic. And I would have expected perhaps that the draft guidelines could tie their hands of the Commission a little bit more than the previous guidelines, but that hasn't happened. And then you have verifiability. Now, the problem with verifiability is that, again, it's very subjective. I mean, efficiencies that are going to be materialized in the future are necessarily speculative. And so in the absence of verification from third parties, you have the market test. And unless the internal documents are incredibly explicit over the years, it's going to be hard to assess the credibility of claims. So that's why the Commission, to some extent, asks for quantification. But that is very problematic because quantifying is hard. In order to quantify, you need to make assumptions because these are efficiencies that will materialize in the future, and every assumption can be criticized. That is precisely one of the reasons why the draft guidelines don't require the Commission to quantify anti-competitive effects, because I think that would impose a very significant burden,
very high burden, yes,
on the Commission. The same applies to the parties. And then the real and much more significant problem has to do with balancing. So suppose that you are able to do all this, you are able to quantify your efficiencies, they are backed up by your internal documents, and you're able to argue convincingly that there is no alternative to achieve those efficiencies, and that you're not going to claw back a disproportionate amount of those efficiencies. Still, those efficiencies need to offset the potential anti-competitive effects. Now, the anti-competitive effects, in many instances, are not going to be quantified. So suppose that you are arguing that efficiencies are, 100 million euros in the next 3 years. Against what? How is that balancing going to take place? Now, there are some instances where the Commission can go and quantify anti-competitive effects. We have seen that in some transactions, and in that case, there may be some balancing. But the Commission is reluctant, for reasons that I fully understand, to commit to quantify anti-competitive effects in every single transaction. So suppose that all that you have is anti-competitive effects based on structural indicators. The combined market share is 52%. And you have efficiencies of 100 million or 1 billion. How do we do that? So I think that if the Commission is serious about in the future considering and implementing an efficiency defense based on this theory of benefit articulated by the parties, it needs to develop more than it has done thus far the way in which it's going to handle balancing. There are many pages on balancing in the draft guidelines, but they are neither here nor there. To some extent, they tell us how difficult it is. So let me give you an idea of how this could be advanced, a constructive idea. And actually, it's not just theoretical. It is based on one of the cases in which I was involved many years ago, an Article 101 case. An Article 101 case. And this was one of the airline alliances, Star Alliance. Star Alliance that involves Lufthansa, United in the US, and a number of other companies. So there, we had invested considerable time and effort in producing efficiencies, and we had been able to quantify. After months of debate, I think that we had been able to argue that many, if not most, of these efficiencies were merger-specific, and we had been able to quantify the fraction of those efficiencies that were going to benefit consumers. So we went there, and we told the Commission, okay, so now, are you going to quantify your anti-competitive effects so that we can balance? No, because this is a restriction by object. We don't need to quantify effects. But if you don't quantify effects, how are we going to balance? After months of debate, there was an agreement, which has been to some extent specific to that case. To the best of my understanding, it hasn't carried through to other cases, but it was an agreement. And that was, okay, so you have this quantification of efficiencies. Tell us, and there are, efficiencies for each of the routes affected by this alliance. For each route, tell us whether the efficiencies are greater or smaller than 10% of the average fare on that route. In other words, the Commission was sort of presuming that the infringement by effect was going to produce a price effect no greater than 10%. We were able to argue efficiencies greater than 10%, a fortiori, we were above the maximum anti-competitive effect, and therefore they were willing to clear. And that's what they did. For many, many routes, those routes where we were able to establish that efficiencies were greater or equal than 10% of the fare in that route, then the deal was clear. The alliance was allowed to be implemented. There was one route in which our efficiencies were significant, but didn't reach the level of 10% of the fare, and that route was then carved out from the alliance, and the parties had to remain competing. That is something that, mutatis mutandi, could be applied in the context of merger control. If the Commission is willing to say, if you show efficiencies greater than 10%, why am I not using 10% is because a merger is not an infringement by object. So you may be a little bit more lenient, 5-10%, then so be it. I was referring a second ago, and with this I will conclude on this question. I was referring a second ago to this document that the Commission has published, I think that yesterday or the day before. This is the latest competition brief, in which they quantify the benefits of competition policy for consumers. I've read it very quickly, so you need to check this. But my impression is that when they talk about the savings that their decisions have generated for consumers, and when they focus attention on mergers, they are basically saying that their decisions have prevented price increases ranging from 3 to 5%. Okay, if that's it, then the 3 to 5% may be the materiality threshold for anti-competitive effects that we need to beat with efficiencies. So if I show efficiencies of 5% or more after the various filters, then you get me a wild card. You would give me permission to go forward. That would be a way of moving forward from the current draft guidelines to a new guidelines, where I think that then the parties could think, okay, it's not just that they are talking the talk, they are prepared to walk the walk. And the way that they are prepared to do this is by implementing this. There may be still type 1 errors, in the sense that the anti-competitive effects may be 2% and the efficiencies are 4%, and there is no wildcard, but it will narrow the scope of those type 1 errors very, very significantly without increasing the type 2 errors, the false acquittals, because ultimately we think that we are on average getting efficiencies that exceed what on average are the price effects that we're preventing.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. I was exactly thinking that rather than quantifying specific anti-competitive effects to an amount that can be compared with efficiencies, you can define a threshold, a reasonability threshold, or an average, as you said, that might serve to compare. That's a very interesting idea. So, theories of benefit and efficiencies in the right direction. Let's wait to see how this materializes in the balancing act. Dr. Padilla, one additional point. we wanted to discuss with you has to do with, and these guidelines focus a lot on the dynamic competitive potential, innovation, R&D, etc., which I think seeks to address the productivity gap that you spoke of before. And one of the ideas which I think is new is the innovation shield, something that comes up here in the guidelines as a mechanism that would, in many scenarios, exempt the acquisition of startups or small innovative companies from a finding of significant impediment of effect on effective competition in relation to any theory of harm, depending on certain conditions relating to the size of the overlap between the buyer and the targets, and the kind of overlap, whether it covers only R&D pipeline projects or actual products already. And is also subject to combined market share thresholds and to the evaluation on the number of independent R&D companies that remain after the merger within the same innovation space. At the same time, the innovation shield is not available to buyers who are either the largest firms, so dominant on their markets, or a gatekeeper under the DMA, the Digital Markets Act. So, and these will probably fall under the entrenchment category further down the line. The idea here is, to me at least, this innovation shield almost seems designed to facilitate catch-up acquisitions of innovative startups, say in the tech space, biotech, biopharma, whichever sector, by European firms, as long as they are mid-sized, so they're number 2 or 3 or 4 in their markets, at the same time as it excludes dominant players as suitable buyers. This kind of seems to play into the need to plug that productivity gap, especially in technology, digital markets, AI nowadays. Is this a subtle industrial policy idea that's kind of introduced here as an analytical tool of substantive analysis? Is this also going for other goals, or am I just reading this wrong?
No, I think that you're reading it right. What I was going to say is that whether we call it industrial policy or merger control, it doesn't really matter. I think that I was going to quote the former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping when he said, black cat, white cat, what matters is that it catches mice. So I think that it may be industrial policy, it may be merger control. I think that merger control is a form of industrial policy, to tell you the truth. But I think that it goes in the right direction. One feature of the merger control that I criticized in the past is that it didn't distinguish sufficiently between mergers involving industry leaders and mergers involving industry laggards. And that's particularly important when the laggards compete not only on price, but compete on quality. And by merging, they may be able to catch up with the leader and do two things. One is to reduce the gap between the two, therefore increasing choice for consumers, but also inducing the leader to exercise effort and to, perhaps, relax less than he would do. So I think that it makes sense, first, to be open to transactions that involve startups, because the startups typically need to, the investors in startups at one point want to exit. And they want to exit because they may not have the resources to scale up the startup successfully. And there are two ways to exit. One is IPOs and the other one is mergers. And so just as in simple terms, you don't want to foreclose one of the two ways in which you can these investors can exit. If you don't give them the option to exit profitably, they're not going to invest in the first place.
Yeah.
Okay. So having
the
mergers,
pipeline.
yeah, and IPOs have their own problems. Okay, IPOs are not easy. In fact, one thing that is interesting is that for a long period of time, most people thought that these were two entirely separate ways to exit. The reality is that if you make the exit through mergers difficult, you are also actually making exit through IPOs difficult, because oftentimes the investors that buy shares in these IPOs are also thinking about potential consolidation in the future, and they wouldn't buy shares if they don't think that eventually they're going to be able to exit. And by the way, one of the reasons why people, investors or companies, startups, choose the IPO route is because they want to have paper, because this paper can help them fund acquisitions without real money in the future. So, but if these acquisitions are not available, then they may not need paper in the first place. So you may not have the IPO. So I think that it is important then that for startups we preserve the transaction option as an exit mechanism. Now, what you don't want is those startups to end up in the hands of people that simply get their projects or their products and shelf them. And those are more likely to be the industry leaders than the industry laggards. And so I think that if you are going to create a safe harbor, it makes sense that you create that safe harbor for transactions that involve startups that go to laggards. And if those laggards are laggards, they are not going to be the biggest one. They will operate in markets where there are leaders, so there are other players innovating. And most likely, because they are laggards, they are unlikely to have exactly the same product or the same research project than the startups that they are acquiring. Those things are all good, and I think that the Commission is moving in the right direction. Now, the question is, what happens if you don't fall within the criteria that define the safe harbor? Can you then presume that this transaction is bad? Can we presume that every single acquisition of a startup by an industry leader is bad for consumers? I don't think that you can hold that presumption. I think that you cannot credit it with the safe harbor. You cannot benefit it with the safe harbor. But that doesn't mean that you don't have then to do a close scrutiny to assess indeed whether the motive behind that acquisition is just entrenchment of a dominant position, or there is something else, and there are efficiencies. And again, that brings us back to the discussion before.
Thank you. So one other move in the right direction, hopefully for European startups. Dr. Padilla, I had one final topic to put to you, which has to do with this is a minor segment of the draft guidelines, except it's interesting for us because Portugal has kind of been a poster child for non-poach and wage fixing antitrust enforcement in labor markets. The draft merger guidelines introduce a section on purchasing markets, which has some interesting considerations on how mergers may impact market power on labor markets, and especially the Commission makes clear that it will evaluate if mergers, by enhancing the merged firms' buying power, so to speak, in the upstream supply of labor, if this is liable to make things worse for workers of the merged firms, so to depress wages, to lead to worse working conditions, or decrease mobility of workers. And I think the point here is kind of a confirmatory question. I think might be wrong once again. Do you see in the future that there might be space for, if the Commission or the National Competition Authority identifies a merger scenario where that might severely harm workers, so a material upstream impact in labor markets, that this might be sufficient to support a negative conclusion, so to support a CIEC case? Or is it the case that it will always be necessary, as I expect, for the competition authorities to show that the upstream impact on labor markets somehow also filters down to consumers in the form of higher prices, less quality, etc.?
That is, again, a very interesting but a very difficult one. So I think that there is part of the answer is simple, but then I will go to the complicated parts. So should we care about workers? My opinion, yes. I look, like any other input providers. I remember doing many years ago cases involving potential mergers in the tobacco industry. And the tobacco industry has a merger in the tobacco industry has implications downstream for consumers, but it has also implications upstream. For example, tobacco suppliers, the growers, and can therefore have an impact in input markets and an impact on output markets. So why are you going to treat workers in a different way that you would take, all these farmers that are growing tobacco? The workers are selling their work. The tobacco producers are selling the tobacco leaves, and then there are consumers. And by the way, think about mergers that are taking place in what we call two-sided markets. So if you have, imagine a potential merger between two search engines, that's going to affect advertisers and it's going to affect consumers. And you would expect the competition agencies to look at both sides. So that's the easy part. Should we care about the impact of transactions on labor markets? Yes, we should. Now, the difficult part. What if the impact on the labor market is adverse, in the sense that you expect to see reductions in wages, but those reductions in wages may actually be passed on to a large extent to consumers, so that the net effect on consumer welfare is positive? Because from the perspective of the consumer welfare, that's a procurement efficiency.
Yeah, it's a cost reduction.
Right. And that takes us to something which I think that is still not well sorted out in the draft guidelines, which is, how do we balance across markets? Or if you wouldn't, so that I use the same terminology of the draft guidelines, what do we do with out-of-market efficiencies? Because if we take the view of the draft guidelines, which is consistent with previous guidelines and is consistent with the Article 103 guidelines and recital 43 of the 103 guidelines, you cannot compensate across markets. Each consumer efficiencies have to be credited only if they benefit consumers in
the
a particular
same consumer
market.
group that are, yes.
So you cannot trade off the benefits to consumers against the harm to the workers, unless the consumers and the workers happen to be the same, which is very unlikely in most transactions. So what do we do then? I think that needs to be specified. So my view is, in conclusion, that if the Commission wants to take seriously, and I think that they should, the issue of the impact of transaction on labor markets, it needs to potentially reconsider its position with respect to out-of-market efficiencies. I understand that lawyers think that recital 43 of the 1013 guidelines and these other statements in the old merger guidelines and new merger guidelines are inconsistent with the case law. So that tells me that perhaps there is room for a change in doctrine. As an economist, I cannot really help there, because I think that the position is fundamentally ideological, or if you want, moral. Are you willing to trade off benefits and costs across society? All that I would tell you is that we do in many other areas of economic policy. You tax some people and you give money to somebody else, that involves making some people better off at the expense of others, and there are many other examples. So that is important. It's important not only in the context of labor markets. It will be important for how seriously we take issues such as sustainability, the environment, resilience, etc., etc. But in particular, I think that here I think that the new draft guidelines expose tension and inconsistency. If you want to do work and focus on potential effects in labor markets, you're going to have to deal with compensating efficiencies on the other side. And if you don't want to do that, then you're only going to intervene when there is harm to the labor markets, if that harm is consistent with harm to consumers.
Consumer welfare, yeah. Very interesting.
It's not clear to me from the draft guidelines what the position is ultimately. I think that It's like, and it's not surprising because, I mean, writing a piece like this is such a complex exercise. But, I think that the right hand may have written one section, the left hand may have written the other. Now we need, from the draft to the end guidelines, that the both hands talk to each other.
Or as for European industry, we need to consolidate.
Yes.
We need to consolidate the guidelines. Dr. Padilla, thank you very much. I'm going to study up on this point of impacts on labor markets and out of market efficiencies. It's been a very interesting discussion. Thank you for taking the time. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Join us again soon for the next episode of Thinking Competition.